and we're honored to have you with us today, Scrabber.
It's my pleasure, Walter. Thank you.
Let's see, you graduated from Marion High School and went to the Emory and Henry College, correct?
Yes,
And you were one of the first African Americans in college there, right?
I was the first male African American enrolled as a full-time student and the first African American athlete to play sports there.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences growing up in the area?
Yes, that experience has been one of the more favorable memories that I have, because if we go back even further than my arrival at Emory and Henry, being from Smith County, I had the pleasure and the privilege of being involved with summer sports. Many of the ball players, baseball, little league football, as young as 8 or 9 years old, when I began to play, I was playing with boys who were from my neighborhood and from my community. When I arrived at Emory and Henry College, there were probably 5 or 6 players on the team who were players that I knew since I was 8 or 9 years old. So I sort of walked into a very familiar environment. So I did not have the typical issues that I think a lot of students, minority students, may have had in the mid to late 60s when they integrated colleges. The environment I was in on campus for that period of time saw the assassination of the Kennedy, not trying to think of Bobby Kennedy. It was assassination of Martin Luther King. Those two events happened during my 4 years there. And not only that, as you mentioned, the Vietnam War created a lot of energy on campus as well. So yeah, it was a tumultuous time there during that period, certainly for the country. But again, I think the college handled things reasonably well. I cannot, in all honesty, say that I had a tough time at college from a racial standpoint. I appreciated that honesty and that equality that I experienced when I was there. I arrived at Emory as a running back. I had some success in high school and I had a lot more success at Marion Senior High, which is where I attended when they first integrated. 2 weeks into practice, the regular safety got injured, and Coach Ramsey asked me if I would play safety. I had a moment of reluctance, but I had never sat on the bench, and I thought, well, this will at least get me off the bench. And as it turned out, I started 35 or 36 games without a break until I had an injury in my mid-year in my senior year. Just completed an 8-year stint with the Board of Trustees that ended in 2019. I was proud to be able to do that. I had an uncle whose name was Jim Broddy, was from West Virginia, but he was a school teacher, an art teacher in New York City. And when he retired, he had heard through folklore, through family folklore, that our family had a slave in our history, and the slave lived near around Washington County, Smith County, and he was emancipated. I think that was the most interesting thing that Uncle Jim found about this folklore, was that if in fact this ancestor was emancipated, it predated Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. He thought that was intriguing. And not only that, he thought if it had happened, we might be around the 200th anniversary of that emancipation. So he spent a lot of his early retirement years searching for that information, confirming that information, and he found it. He found it at the courthouse in Smith County. He found the signed Emancipation Papers issued by Francis Preston, who was married to Sarah Campbell at that time, and in 1793, he was emancipated. Now, during his search for John Broddy, I was sort of Uncle Jim's favorite nephew. He made numerous visits from New York out here, and I did the same going to New York, 10, 15 years before he passed away in the 90s. He did his best to convince me that I should get involved in this, that I should help him do this search. And I kept pushing back. I told him I can't do it. I'm 2,000 miles away. I'm trying to raise a family, trying to do a career. I don't even know if I care about John Broddy. I didn't see the relevance in my life at the time. And then Uncle Jim, as I said, he did find what he was looking for. I resisted any help to give him. He was asking for it. And then when he passed away in the mid-90s, 1990s, all of that material got dropped off on my doorstep. Everyone else thought I was helping him, that I knew all about this. And so when I opened up the box and looked in it, I found all this material, and I was intrigued, fascinated. And I thought, in honor of Uncle Jim and in honor of John Broddy, I should pursue the additional information that we knew was out there at that point. Well, John Broddy was on that trip. Part of my research is why was he on that trip? I have a book by Nellie Preston. It's a fictional account. It's supposedly the papers that were prepared, written memoirs by Elizabeth Henry Campbell, who these papers ended up with her sixth great-granddaughter, Nellie Preston, who took these papers and put together this fictional book. And in this book, it says that it was Elizabeth who insisted on John traveling to Kings Mountain with her husband, William. It says in the book that your purpose is to do all you can to keep him safe, bring him back home. Now that was interesting to me, that you take John to a battle, but as it turns out, his being in Kings Mountain created quite a controversy. You are probably familiar with the controversy that's known as the Strange Campbell Shelby controversy. There's a whole 30 or 40 pages written about this controversy, where John was at the battle and he was mistaken for Campbell. Well, Campbell was mistaken for John. Shelby, who was the governor, ended up being the governor twice of Kentucky, was at that battle, and he accused Campbell of being a coward. And because he saw Campbell sitting on a horse off in the distance, and he wasn't fighting alongside his men as all the others were at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Of course, historians just went crazy over this allegation, and they ended up pursuing what they thought, what is the truth behind this allegation? Is it true or not? And so that's one key reason, Walter, why we know as much as we know about Walter. It's amazing. You go on this hike, this trek to Kings Mountain to fight a battle. You fight a battle for 1 hour. You go back home, and I don't remember exactly. 20 years later, John Broddy is thrust in the middle of a controversy.
William Campbell died fairly young.
Yeah,
Or-
he died approximately 2 years after the Battle of Kings Mountain. Yes.
So when the
So he was
controversy
dead. He was dead when this allegation was made. He was already dead.
so
Nellie writes a very detailed description of that battle that she's taken from Elizabeth's notes. It tells where each of there were 3 or 4 different commanders that came from different directions with their militia. And before the battle, they appoint Campbell to be the leader of all of them. But each one had responsibility, commander had responsibility for their own militia. And they were placed strategically around the base of the mountain. Ferguson's men had set themselves up at the top of the mountain, thinking they were in an advantaged position there. Turned out not to be true. They, in fact, trapped themselves at the top. I would just like to point out one more thing. There's actually a book, Eyewitnesses Account. These are men that were sought out after the controversy. These were men who were at the battle, and they did interviews on whether or not Campbell was actually in the battle or not, fighting. You have some accounts where they said, we saw him sitting on a horse off in the distance, and there's other accounts that says his sleeves were rolled up and he was beside me firing his gun. So in the fog of battle, who knows what went on? But to me, it's fascinating, not only in the other book I just showed you, but in this one, John is the centerpiece of the discussion. Okay, so I don't know too many slaves that have enjoyed that level of notoriety. The allegation, in a nutshell, is that William Campbell, he alleges that he saw William Campbell sitting off in the distance on his horse, and that he did not believe that Campbell was in the battle fighting. It turns out, and it's believed by the historians based on eyewitness information, that during that battle, the fact that it was a militia fighting, Campbell did not want to wear his military jacket. He was one of the few military people there. And it was suicidal, or it was crazy to wear your military jacket in that battle because you were a target. Everybody would be shooting for you. He assigned John Broddy to take care of his horse. It's reported that his horse was skittish, especially during gunfire, to take his horse and his jacket and get out of harm's way, get off in the distance and stay away. So it was fairly natural to think, if you looked over and saw a horse that was belonging to Campbell, saw someone wearing the jacket, you knew to be Campbell's. And the third factor is that there is this report that John and Campbell resembled one another. The resemblance is part of what fueled this belief that it was Campbell sitting on the horse. They are reported to have looked so closely, resembled each other so closely, that it was a natural mistake to make. So, but those are the 3 factors that came into that allegation. He was dressed like Campbell, he had Campbell's horse, and he appeared to look like Campbell from a distance. Two things came about. There was the first, when this controversy came up, the historian that looked into it, the leading historian that looked into it at that time, came up with the conclusion that that the mistaken identity had to be because they were half brothers. They were looked at that closely, thought it was, the resemblance was that close. After the book came out, Paths of Glory, there's a passage in there where John describes where he came from. And John describes him being kidnapped from a village in India, a port village, and was loaded on a slave trip, on a tea ship, and transported to Annapolis. And it was there that he was purchased by Charles Campbell, William Campbell's father, and brought to the Campbell estate. And that's where he grew up. Now, one of the interesting things about that account is he says he's asked by Elizabeth in this dialogue, where did the name Broddy come from? And he said, I was taken from a port city called Broddy. That's a Baroda, Broddy. And when he was asked when he came to America, what's your name? He said, all I could think of was the name Broddy. And people started calling me Broddy. And John was just thrown in there. Now, I've researched this, and in fact, Walter, there is a port town in India that tea ships left out of coming to America. India tea, the Indian tea came out of that port. And it was, in fact, in the 1700s, a port named by that name. Today, it has a different name. But you can look at maps of that period of time, and there is a port town by that name. So to kind of bring all of this to shore here, about 55% of me believes the story that John came from another place. Okay? And my basis for that is, one, I have a hard time believing that someone would go to the trouble of fabricating a story like that, even if it's a fictional account. Why would you go to that length to fabricate a story about a slave who's not the key part of the whole story? John's a minor player in this story, in the fictional account. Why would you do that? The second basis for this is, I believe that John, if he came from India, he did not look like an African. He would not have the physical characteristics of an African. And in Virginia, you were familiar with Africans being slaves. And if you came and looked like something different, if you grew up looking different, the default was you had to be a mulatto. You had to be something other than pure African. And I think that played potentially into this story. And the third part is I've done one run with my DNA with the Campbells. There's not been any matches as far as our DNA matching with the Campbell's DNA. I've not relied a lot on that because you need to do numerous DNA experiments or analysis before you come to an absolute conclusion. But so far, 1 for 0, okay, on the DNA part. The early migrations came from Africa to India of Africans. So the migration of people is one thing. And my DNA shows Africa, and it also shows parts of Asia as well. So the DNA is not giving me an absolute clear answer to this. But the explanation I was given was, it's possible that John had African DNA. It would have to do with how, going back looking at his ancestry, where did they come from? And there's a great likelihood that they came from Africa, through some migration. That's the best answer I've been given. The story in the book says that John arrived in Annapolis. When the ship arrived in America, this tea ship, and by the way, it had, in the book it said there were some slaves in the bottom of this ship. They were being smuggled in because it was not a lawful slave ship. It was not a sanctioned, authorized slave ship. It was a tea ship. The cargo was tea, but they were smuggling slaves. And he says in this book, I wasn't put down below with the rest of the slaves. I was allowed to stay on top. But when it arrived in Annapolis, there were slaves that, according to this book, slaves that were sold. But John was 3 or 4 years old at the time, and Charles Campbell purchased John in Annapolis. After the war, John remained in the Campbell family. He remained a slave to William Campbell. And after Campbell passed away, by this time, Sarah had married Francis Preston. And in William Campbell's will, he stipulated that at his death, Campbell's death, that John was to be freed. And he says specifically because of his service and his support of Campbell during wartime. I could come back to that because that's part of my little research today. But it was almost 13, 14 years after Campbell's death, 11 years after Campbell's death, before John was emancipated. Okay. And so there's been a lot of discussion. And at that time, when Campbell passed away, John did not become the property of Elizabeth. He became the property of Sarah. So he was actually Sarah's slave. So John was emancipated in the early 1790s, and he and his family were given property, which you may have heard of, the Broddy Bottom, which is a piece of property in Saltville. And that's another interesting thing. You didn't free slaves and you didn't give them property to live on either, right? So there's a lot of these little spin-off issues that I've been pursuing, but that's one of them. I think they believe that John would have been, his life would have been in jeopardy, or his freedom would have been in jeopardy if they just freed him without some assurance that John was going to be okay. I think that's part of what took place for 12 years before they emancipated him. They knew he was okay. They knew his family was okay as long as they were under the protection of the Campbells. Yes, John lived. John was approximately 50 years old when he was freed, and John lived another 50 years. John was about 100 years old when he passed away. Every September, there's a formal recognition of John and William Campbell. Members from the National Park Service from Kings Mountain come to 7 Mile Ford. You're familiar with 7 Mile Ford? They come to 7 Mile Ford, what we call Aspenvale. This is where William Campbell is buried. And they have a short ceremony there recognizing William Campbell. They also then journey over to Saltville, and they have a similar ceremony for John Broddy there. This goes on every year. Ninety 95% of what I know about John Broddy, the patriot, 95% of my relatives don't know. Okay. Now, part of that is my fault. I have gone to 2 or 3 reunions, and I have had an hour or two where I have shared information with them. They've asked me to talk about it. But I recognize, Walter, they're like me. And I'm always reminded of how I found myself ignoring Uncle Jim. You know, it's very tough for people to get excited about someone 250 years ago. If you're busy today trying to put food on the table, trying to deal with current issues, whether it's education, whether it's employment, it's hard to just sit down and focus on what is going on. This has been a fascinating journey for me because, as you point out, I am familiar with a lot of people who are part of Sons of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution. I'm unique. Even white members of Sons of American Revolution don't have the volume of things that I have. I have John referenced in 11 different sources. I think I have more on John than the country has on Crispus Attucks. Okay, it's amazing to me, and to think how close we came to not knowing anything. How close we came that one aging gentleman in New York City who had heard rumors one day was inspired enough to go looking to see if those rumors were true. That's how close we wouldn't know anything. That's how close I wouldn't know about Kings Mountain Elementary School. That's how close I wouldn't know about all the markers up and down the highway in Abingdon commemorating William Campbell. It's how remarkable that I lived only 10 miles away from Aspenvale and didn't know I had a connection with it. It's remarkable. None of these things were talked about in my family and my grandparents' generation. We never said, and we loved each other. We sat around dinner tables and, you know, we were always talking about family. We never talked about that.
Thank you for this conversation. We're going to open this up now to people in the audience who want to ask questions. So, Scrapper, are you with us? Scrapper is in Kennewick, Washington, so it may take a few minutes for the transmission to get there and back. That's a joke. This is called burning time until I'm looking for him on the screen to see if he's showing up. He did tell me earlier that he was on, so it's possible that something happened. I'm just checking the list real quick. Does anyone have any comment about Scrapper? Anyone remember him from? There he is. Scrapper, you want to unmute yourself? Turn on your camera. Don't be shy. There you are. Hello, my friend. How are you? Can't hear you. I cannot hear you. Still cannot hear you.
How about now?
That's much better. What did you plug in?
Okay, how you doing?
Good. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Any comments about the video before we open it up for questions?
You did a great job, Walter. You made me look good.
You did a great job. There's a mutual admiration society here.
I do have a couple of quick comments. I've been on all day. I've been fascinated. Your first, I had a little trouble getting started, but Garrett and Elijah, I would love to have more time with them. I noticed that Garrett is somewhat of an authoritarian on John Broddy. And I think he and I could share notes, and I could learn a lot from Garrett's knowledge and information.
Scrapper, if you'll recall, when you were at the Sons of the American Revolution event at John Broddy's grave, you told me you were there a couple of times.
Yes.
Garrett was the MC for at least one of those.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have to do that again. And my compliments also to Elijah. I think he's done a wonderful job. He's got a total grasp on, I think, things that have gone on there for 250, 300 years. I'd like to also point out Jerry Jones. Jerry, I am mentioned in that book. I'm a celebrity. Jerry's made me a celebrity. Jerry and I, he doesn't like to mention it, obviously, but Jerry and I rode the school bus to Douglas High School. Jerry was a year ahead of me. Jerry was the senior president of the school, student president. I was the junior vice president. So Jerry and I have a lot of road time together, riding back and forth to Douglas. And as I said, he's also affiliated with Emory Henry College. So I think what goes around comes around. So you have some interesting people on there today that I've got a lot of history with.
Very good. Yeah, I agree with you. Someone asked a question about the DNA. What does current DNA say about Broddy's descendants and you?
I don't have DNA on John Broddy, of course. My DNA, I'm gonna guess, I've got my DNA authority sitting around here, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. My DNA is about 51% non-Caucasian. It's about 48, 49% Caucasian, European. Now, on both sides of my family, there are cases of interracial connections. So I'm not surprised at that. But my real focus was on John Broddy. And of course, I wish I had his DNA. That would certainly help out a lot. I wish I had William Campbell's DNA also. That would solve a few of my questions. But right now, it's DNA hasn't been that helpful in some respects, and maybe it has been in others.
And it's my understanding if you go back far enough, and Kenyatta can probably shed a little more light on this above what she said earlier this afternoon, that if you go back far enough, it's very possible that you may still be related to someone, but there are no DNA markers connecting you. Is that right?
I think that's probably true. I think you can dilute it enough to where there's DNA that's not doesn't, unless you've got a highly sophisticated analysis. I think the commercial ones don't probably get you deep into it enough to provide you that level of information.
And someone asked if you have any East Indian DNA.
Not specifically, no.
But you have some Asian.
Yes.
Another person asked, what Little League teams did you play on in Marion? Who coached you and what other Black children played?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I remember those guys. My first coach, I played for the First Methodist Church, White Church, still in Marion, sitting there on the corner. I was the First Methodist Church Little League baseball player. My first coach was a guy named Joe Snavely. He had a son my age, and Joe and I graduated together at Marion Senior High, played football together. So it was Joe Snavely was my coach. My football coach were several guys from graduated from Emory and Henry College. So I played on what was called the Cleveland Browns Little League. So if there's anybody out there in the audience that played during that time, you can validate that without any trouble. There were 3 or 4 black players on the team during that time. Stevie Henderson, the Hendersons in Marion were a fairly large family. Stevie and I were born 2 days apart. Our mothers were in the hospital together at the same time, giving birth. So Stevie Henderson was, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Sharps in Marion. That's a family, black family that was pretty prominent. They owned, the Sharps owned the barber shop that had the white customer base. It was very unusual to have a black entrepreneur who has a white only customer base. And they did. Maybe somebody out there knows about the Broad Street Tea Room, which was a bar that the Sharps owned also. But the Broad Street Tea Room was the only social location all the way from probably Knoxville to Roanoke that blacks could go to and enjoy a beer in public. So if there's anybody in the audience that can verify any of that or would like to talk about that, I'm happy to do it.
Someone asked if you had been in contact with any Campbell descendants, I suppose, to see if they wanted to do a DNA test.
I was, that's who I sent my DNA results to, that I believe they conducted their own analysis. I have contacts with the Campbells. I just have not pursued a second test with them.
If you know Deborah and Diane Hayes, they are on the program today. They said hello.
Well, thank you. I know both of them. Deborah is an alumni of Emory and Henry College. Deborah and I got inducted in the Sports Hall of Fame at the same time. And of course, her sister Diane Hayes is probably the best known genealogist or ancestry person back there in Marion who looks into the history of blacks. So I know both of those ladies. They were much younger than me, but I know who they are.
And your cousin Stephanie Sharp says hello.
Stephanie is a Sharp. It's her grandfather that was the owner of the bar and owner of the barber shop. So yes, Stephanie and I we're cousins. Her grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. Hi, Stephanie.
And I believe you told me you're planning on coming back to Southwest Virginia later this fall.
I'm hoping to come back and spend 3 or 4 weeks. I want to dedicate some quality time to some research. Research I can't do 2,000 miles away. It's a little frustrating and time consuming trying to do it the hard way. But I think I can spend some quality time there and get some work done. Look forward to seeing all of you. Hopefully I can meet Elijah and Garrett and the rest of you there.
Well, we hope you will come by the Historical Society while you're in town.
This has been a great program. I hope you can do it each year. I think there's a lot of things brought out today that people don't really know.
I agree with you, and that is my hope as well, that we can do that and build from this foundation.
Thank you very much.
Scrapper, thank you very much for being part of this program. Very interesting.
Thank you.